but will shine in the age to come. I'm going to welcome up our scripture reader for today, Miriam.
If you are able to, please remain standing for the reading of the word. Our scripture reading is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." Gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He is gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I had cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to the word of the Lord." Please be seated.
Amen. Amen. Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Hope Church. My name is Drew. I'm one of the pastors here, and it's been a bit since I've been able to be here with you all here in the East Village, but it's a joy. We've actually, in the season of Lent, which is a season in which around the world the Christian church actually commemorates this season of Lent as this time in which we're anticipating Holy Week and, of course, the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Here's the thing. We as Christians, we believe that Jesus was actually a real person who really lived, really died, and really resurrected from the grave. And so we believe it's not just a myth or just some sort of philosophy that we believe in, but actually a person who came to change the course of human history and the world. And so during the season of Lent, we've been actually looking at some eyewitness accounts of Jesus and what he taught. And so if you're new to faith, or maybe you're just coming back into this church thing, it's a great series to be here because we're actually looking at these texts that recount the story of Jesus from the pages of Scripture. So we're not, it's not kind of what Christians believe about kind of, or even what people might think of when they think about Christians or Christianity today, but what does the original source documents have to say about Jesus, what he did, what he said, what he taught, and what he was about. And so today we actually look at this encounter that Jesus has with someone named Zacchaeus. Now again, these names as well as roles and time periods, the reason they're mentioned is because the Gospel of Luke is a historical document, which is why they get at, hey, listen, if you want to know whether this is true or not, check these receipts. The brother's name was Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector. He lived during this time period, which is why all of these different kind of notes are given about these historical figures. Now, with that said, here's what we believe as Christians, is not only is this a historical kind of event and a person that really intersected with real people, but it actually relates to our lives today. And in fact, when I was thinking about kind of the cultural narratives or the scriptures, or not the scriptures, but the stories that a lot of us buy into about what shapes our lives, our imaginations, as well as what gives us reasons to live, to be, the purpose for why we do what we do when it comes to our career and relationships and things like that, whether you're religious or you're not. I was thinking about what are some of the stories that have shaped today's world and our age, and what does Jesus have to say about some of those things? Recent years, I came across this book by Greg Lukianoff as well as Jonathan Haidt, who's a professor at NYU. And they wrote this book called The Coddling of the American Mind. And it's how good intentions and bad ideas are setting up a generation for failure. Very hopeful book. No, I'm just kidding. Right? Like they basically write about how current generations have been shaped by a certain approach to life. And that approach to life is basically most modern parents have taken this way of parenting in which they want to protect their children from all the evils and difficulties of the world. And as a result, there's they recount about how the cultural narrative then is the coddling of the American mind. What happens in further generations is people tend to be very self-protective, very fragile when it comes to anything difficult or hard. Now, as I was reflecting on this book and some of the premises of this book, I was thinking about myself. I have a son who's 14 and a daughter who's 10 now. And my own story is my parents grew up in war-torn Korea. So my grandparents actually lived during some parts of Japanese occupation in Korea, and then the Korean War. So they were coming from a war-torn, impoverished nation, And my parents grew up under that. They immigrated to the States in the 70s. And listen, the story that I often heard from my parents was basically like, listen, I came here with very little money. We didn't do any vacations. We came here and we hustled. We worked multiple jobs so that you guys could make it and, make it here in this country and show all these white people. No, I'm just kidding. But basically just show all these people that we belong. And not only do we belong, but we can achieve here. So you got to understand, like, I grew up then in this constant story that I grew up with of what I saw from my parents and what they told me about the stories of their grandparents was basically like, life is hard and difficult. We came here to build you a better life. And the reality is, I grew up in a time in the 80s and the 90s, being an ethnic Korean, yet being like all sorts of racism that we grew up with, being called names, the shape of our eyes were constantly made fun of. People were made fun of my parents and their accent. Our home was consistently vandalized. We were bullied a lot as kids. So you got to understand, so in me, I've lived kind of that story of like, life is hard. I want to prove to all these people that I belong here. So now when we have kids, right? So my wife and I, she grew up, Korean American background as well, but grew up in Houston, Texas. Like, you better believe the way I'm trying to raise my kids. Listen, I want to protect them from all the ills of society. Now, it helps that Korean culture is cool now. K-pop Demon Hunter, listen, we never, in our wildest dreams, thought Korean food, Korean culture would be cool. Now, all of a sudden, it's so cool. But not only that, but because of my own background, listen, and the way that my parents kind of raised us or didn't raise us, I grew up with this mentality that life is hard, and now that I have kids, what I want to do, my immediate impulse is to swing to the other pendulum, on the other side of the pendulum, and basically, I want to protect my kids from anything. So I just remember, even when we were raising our newborns, there was this self-protective measure, am I doing things right? Am I being exact in the way that I'm measuring, their stool? And sorry to be so blunt about these things. And have they eaten every 2 hours? There's almost this over-vigilance of over-coddling of my kids. And now that as they've grown up and once they start to recognize that the world is not as protective of a bubble as it is, there's a part of me that wants to shield them from all the ills of society, almost overcompensating for the way that I grew up and the way that my parents' generations grew up. Now, what's so interesting about this book, about Greg Lukianoff as well as Jonathan Haidt, he's saying what's happened then is there's a generation of young people who, whenever things get tough, they will shrivel and as a result become more fragile. Now, again, the premises of these books, they've haunted me because as I think about my own life as a parent and all the ways that I don't want my parents, I don't want my kids to experience any of this pain. And so as a result, I've done my best to try to counteract that some, but it's in me to try to protect them or to coddle them in different ways. Now, this emphasis, though, of protecting my own, of hey, listen, be overly emphasizing how important my kids are and trying to protect them from every ill of the world. See, that kind of emphasis of the self, that we need to protect ourselves, that your happiness really, really matters. It simply is the same story that many of us perhaps have grown up with, especially in today's day and age, of what and who is important. When I talk about the stories that shape us, for instance, I grew up with this image here. It's the image, be happy. High five your neighbor and say, be happy. Don't worry, be happy. This image is an image that, again, when it shaped the narrative of what's important to me and what should be important to others, it's the narrative, just be happy. Whatever you can do to pursue your happiness. Now, that's a fundamentally different story than my parents grew up with, because my parents, it was not about happiness. It was just about survival and grinding. But do you see, today's culture has been shaped by not only coddling of the American mind, but also this narrative to live for is to be happy. If you've watched any Disney movies, I love Disney movies, so much of the stories are about be happy. Now, in each of these different premises, the coddling of the American mind, as well as this be happy kind of narrative, those narratives, what they fundamentally tell us is you live for yourself, to protect yourself, to pursue your own happiness. That's the story that each of us tend to be shaped by, especially in today's culture. Now, here's what's so interesting, is that isn't just a modern phenomenon, this self-preservation, kind of thinking of myself only. This is the human condition since ancient times. And so I want you to see there's actually this story of a person named Zacchaeus that we came to. And think about the stories that have shaped Zacchaeus and how he's living. Notice what it says in this passage. In Luke chapter 19, it says, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and he was wealthy. Now, immediately, chief tax collector rises to someone's consciousness as they're hearing this story. Now, why is that? Because a tax collector, it's different than someone that was simply like an IRS agent or something. This is actually a tax collector. Judea and this region was actually under Roman rule. And so what Rome would do as the oppressive regime over Judea, they would actually hire ethnic Jewish people to collect taxes from their own people. So Zacchaeus was ethnically Jewish, but he was actually hired by the Romans to collect taxes from his own people. So as a result, Zacchaeus is someone that immediately, when someone hears a tax collector, they're immediately like, oh, that person was a sellout. I can't believe they betrayed us. And not only that, but tax collectors during that time, they were known for not only collecting taxes on behalf of Rome, but oftentimes they would cheat the people, their own people, and take off some from the top to keep some money for themselves. So that's why, notice it says, not only was he a chief tax collector, he was wealthy. It immediately, both of those things are actually tied together because it's like, here's Zacchaeus, and not only is he a tax collector, he's a chief tax collector. He's not only the person who collected taxes, he hired other people to also sell out against his own people. So do you understand, like immediately when someone hears this, he was a chief tax collector, immediately people like, there's a sense of, that person's a traitor. How could they do that? How could they work for the oppressive Romans? But not only that, he's a chief tax collector, and by the way, he's wealthy. So immediately, the listener's like, this cat, something is wrong with this guy. He's a chief tax collector, and he got wealthy probably from cheating his own people. So do you understand, like immediately, when people are listening to this, there's already this feeling of like, man, this guy, I cannot believe this person. Now notice what it says. He wanted to see who Jesus was. Now why is this? Because Jesus has already proven himself to be this miracle worker and an extraordinary teacher. Now notice what it says. But because he was short, you know he's a historian. See, look at all these little descriptive things. The brother was short, and because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. Now, notice, right, like normally, if there's someone who's short and there's a crowd, and like usually, if someone sees that someone is shorter, like usually they'll be like, hey, just come up front, like get in front, I can see over you. But there's almost this clue that because he's despised, like people look at him and they're like, oh, he's short. They still don't let him through to watch, right? So look at what he has to resort to. Because he's short and no one would let him kind of see, he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him since Jesus was coming that way. Now, climbing a tree, like it's a little bit, as an adult, I mean, just think about the last time as an adult you climbed a tree. Or some of you, you're probably like, I haven't climbed a tree in years. Now for this guy, Zacchaeus though, he's so desperate to see Jesus that he's willing to do something utterly embarrassing and even shameful. Now look at what happens. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. Now you might hear that and be like, whoa, geez, that's a little bit forward. Like, what are you doing here? Now, this value of actually having a meal and being entered into someone's home is this incredible value of hospitality. When Jesus is actually making this statement, he's making this statement of affection and invitation of like, I want to get to know you. I want to be in a relationship with you. Now, notice what happened. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. But do you remember Zacchaeus' reputation? I mean, it's told to us. He's his chief tax collector, and he's wealthy. All the people saw this, and they began to mutter, I can't believe that, Jesus. He has gone to be the guest of a sinner. Now, do you see every clue and marker here? It's like, Jesus, of all the people you're going to hang out with, of all the people that you're going to spend time with and eat a meal with, it's this guy, someone who's despised, someone who's considered a sinner. Now, if you've been with us in the series of Luke, you know that Jesus constantly, he's interacting and welcoming and relating to people that you wouldn't expect Jesus, a religious figure, to actually align with. But throughout, Jesus has this moniker. He's a friend of sinners. And even this, you could imagine the murmurs and the muttering, like, Jesus, of all the people, you're going to spend time with Zacchaeus? This sinner? This guy who's a traitor? Now, do you see how different of just a mentality that Jesus has? Jesus has actually shown us that he is willing to spend time with the people that others might think are so far from God. Now, here's the thing. Remember, Zacchaeus, how is he described? He's described as wealthy and a chief tax collector. Well, let me say this. So Zacchaeus being wealthy, and he's also despised. That's essentially what the text is telling us. He's got money, and he's someone that everyone looks at and they're like, I can't believe this person. He's a sinner. He's a tax collector. And I was thinking, like today, in today's world, what would the equivalent of someone who is wealthy and despised be? It's a New Yorker. You're like, oh, yeah, that fits. Who is wealthy and despised? Yes, or Donald Trump in some instances. And others. Wow, Anna, thank you for just shouting that out as a congregation. Now, the reason why I align this with wealthy and despised and a New Yorker, there's a part of me, like on one hand, Zacchaeus is seen as someone who's like immediately, like even as I describe Zacchaeus, many of us perhaps we look at him and we're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe he would do that. But in many ways, as I think about Zacchaeus, I think about how Zacchaeus, I see him with a whole lot of sympathy. And the reason why is because I think of someone like Zacchaeus and what probably led him to, and I realize here he is under an oppressive regime. He's just doing his best to make ends meet. And he's basically, what can I do to take care of my family and my own? What can I do to succeed in this game that I'm playing in? And as I think about Zacchaeus, I'm like, oh man, he's someone who's basically just doing whatever they can to hustle and to make it in the city. And I could imagine Zacchaeus being like, listen, don't hate the player, hate the game. In this oppressive regime, I'm just doing whatever it takes to make ends meet. And the reason why I think of this as being so akin to New Yorkers, and even maybe the story that we might find ourselves in, you see, there's a phrase that I often think about when it comes to New York, and it's this phrase, survival of the fittest. Now, some of you might be like, wait, isn't that Darwinian kind of philosophy and like microevolution and isn't that what it's about? Survival of the fittest? Well, listen, survival of the fittest, that whole principle is the same principle that drives so much of our city. It basically is, listen, you don't look out for yourself. I mean, isn't it true? Like, even if you have this modicum of, I want to be someone who doesn't live for myself, then all of a sudden you end up working in the city. And then you realize no one else is looking out for other people. In fact, they're looking out for themselves. You just walk along the street and you realize, gosh, how can I survive in the city when there's such a rush to the subway doors and no one's looking out for me when it comes to, like, am I going to be able to get in enough? Unless they're tourists from, like, California. Just kidding. Or Canada. And the longer we live in the city, we realize, I mean, isn't it true, that this city is a dog-eat-dog kind of city. Survival of the fittest. Now, here's the thing. Most of us Some of us, that's why we love the city. We love the city because it brings out that competitive drive into each of us. In fact, there's that phrase, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. Now, there's a part of me that loves that drive, that survival of the fittest. That's what I love about being in the city, this competitive survival of the fittest. If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere kind of mantra. But notice, which tends to focus on the self-preservation, or the be happy narrative, which focuses on, listen, at the expense of other people, just be happy yourself. This same narrative, survival of the fittest, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. That same mentality is the same mentality of look out for yourself. All of these different stories and narratives, what they continue to tell us, whether consciously or subconsciously, is that what matters most in life is yourself. Live for yourself. Live for your self-preservation. Live for your own survival and your own thriving. And listen, for playing the game. He's wealthy and he's despised. He's just a New Yorker who's trying to make it. And he's honestly played the game quite well. But notice how the story and the trajectory of his life changes. When he meets, look at what happens. It says, after Jesus comes into his home, look at what Zacchaeus does. Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord in front of everyone, here and now, I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Now, what's the significance of what he's saying? Well, generally, when people understood what generosity looked like, back in the ancient days, especially in ancient Judea, most people, like some scholars debate, some people it's 10%, some people it's up to 33%, that people would be called to give generously. But notice what Zacchaeus does. Zacchaeus basically says, actually, I'm going to give half of my possession, 50%. Now, could you imagine? That's like outrageous. Like 10 to 33, even any of those numbers are kind of like, that's a lot to be generous with. But all of a sudden, Zacchaeus comes out with this. He basically says, I'm going to give half of my possessions. And then he says, if I've cheated anybody, I'm going to give 4 times the amount. Now, in the law, it was generally understood that for certain kinds of penalties, you would pay back in full, and then on top of that, 20%. So 0.2, in addition to paying back in full. But here, Zacchaeus goes over and beyond, and he's basically like, no. I'm going to pay back 4 times the amount. Now, isn't that extraordinary? So I just want you to know, like Zacchaeus' response isn't one of just kind of like, kind of skimping on like generosity and even justice. He actually goes over the top. But notice what happens. Look at what Jesus says. Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. So basically, do you see what happens here? Zacchaeus makes this pronouncement. I'm going to pay back. I'm going to give half of my possessions to the poor. That's way more than the 10 to 33%. And I'm going to pay back 4 times as much. That's way more than the 0.2 that you're supposed to pay back for restitution. And all of a sudden, Jesus is basically like, yep, today, salvation has come to this house. Now, honestly, there's a part of me, as like a skeptical New Yorker, I'm kind of like, oh, Jesus, I can't believe you fell for that guy. Like, seriously? Like, that quickly? Like, there's a part of me that's like, honestly, as a skeptical New Yorker, I'm like, Jesus, listen, this guy might talk a good game, but what in the world are you doing? Pronouncing salvation over this house? Like, let's see him change his life for a little bit. All of a sudden he makes this pronouncement, and now you're able to say salvation has come here. He's a sinner. His track record is he's a traitor. What in the world are you doing, Jesus? So here's the question. Why is it that Jesus can say with such authority, no, today salvation has come to this man right now. Why is it that Jesus can do that immediately? Why? Thank you. Why? Because most people, see, Jesus is identifying, for most people, the last and the hardest thing to ever relinquish to God is your money. And when Jesus sees that somehow this encounter has changed Zacchaeus' relationship to money, immediately he knows salvation has come to this house. Why? Because money is that one thing that at the end of the day, it's often the final frontier for any of us to relinquish. It's that one thing that most of us think we don't have a problem or an issue with this. And yet it's the one thing that when you're finally able to relinquish control of your money, God really then has your heart. Now, you and I know this, whether you believe it or not. Like this principle of your money being that final frontier, most of us, maybe even today, you're like, oh, I don't know. The final frontier for me to relinquish might be these other things. But the reality is, most of us know that money tends to be that most important thing. For instance, there's this other phrase in popular culture. It's not even a Christian phrase. Have you heard this phrase? Yeah? You really believe that? Then put your money where your mouth is. Now, where does that phrase come from? See, the phrase comes from this belief that, like, listen, if you really believe that, if you really, really believe that, you're going to put your money where your mouth is. Why? Because most of us intuitively, even though we may not personally admit it or not, we know that money is that final frontier. Now, you know what's interesting is that Jesus would actually teach in the Gospel of Matthew. He says, where your treasure is, that's where your heart is. Now, notice he doesn't say, where your heart is, that's where your treasure is. Now, why does Jesus say where your treasure is, that's where your heart is, as a descriptor, instead of prescribing where your heart is, that's where your treasure is? Why does he say that? Because so many of us can talk about money all day and be like, oh, yes, I am a generous person. The thing about money, though, is there are receipts. And what Jesus is basically saying, just check the receipts. You have your bank account. Where is your cold, hard cash? Because where your cold, hard cash is, that's where your heart is. And the reason why Jesus is able to say to Zacchaeus, salvation has come to this house, because he says, Zacchaeus, this encounter has changed fundamentally the one thing that oftentimes for each one of us is the hardest thing to do, is to actually transform our relationship with our money. And he actually shows us more than this story of self-preservation, of survival of the fittest, coddling of the American mind, be happy, more than any of those stories, the story of generosity, the story of living for something or someone beyond yourself, that truly is the better way. Now, I recognize some of you are like, this is getting uncomfortable. I like the story. I like the fact it's kind of funny how you talked about the real facts about him being short and all these things. But now you're all of a sudden, people are uncomfortable, like, there goes that preacher again talking about money. Oh my goodness. Churches, they constantly talk about money. And now he's going to make this plea to give money. Listen, and whenever our church's approach to money, we've constantly talked about this. Listen, some people, I often tell people, our books are open. We had a town hall here a couple of weeks ago, completely open about our finances, showed it to everyone on screen, was taking any questions that you all had about how our church is stewarding our money. I've mentioned to you all before, like, I don't need your money. And the reason why I don't need your money is because my wife is independently wealthy. Like I've been very open about that. My salary is a position of a church our size, like makes, so my wife, so listen, I'm not going to, so listen, like, so I've been very open about that. And even our church, again, we've been open. We've been trying to model what generosity looks like. We're completely open about where our money goes. And even extending hope, we're legally obligated that every single penny that we raise. So it's not even about giving to the church. If you want to give to these other organizations, give to Extending Hope. We're legally obligated to give towards all of these different missional initiatives. Our little church gave close to $500,000 away last year. Now, listen, I just want you to know, and we've tried to model what generosity looks like because we believe that that's the better way. So listen, I'm not saying all this stuff about money because I want your money or I need your money. I'm saying this because oftentimes money is that final frontier. And the question is, where does your money go? Now, if you're someone who grew up in a background where money and money management with your family was a difficult undertaking, that's why we have classes on managing money here that we want to offer you, because your relationship to your money is fundamentally a spiritual thing as well. Your money and your relationship to it, I want you to know that what we believe as Christians is that generosity truly is a better way. And the question is, what does it look like to be a generous people? Now, some of you are like, oh my goodness, he's going to ask us to give half of our possessions away. He's going to ask to restitution of 4 times the amount. Well, did you notice that Jesus never prescribes to Zacchaeus? He never says to Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus, in order to become a person of faith and to follow me, you have to give away half of your possessions. He doesn't say that. He doesn't prescribe an amount. In fact, there's another encounter that Jesus has with a rich young ruler, where at one point he basically says to the rich young ruler, you need to sell everything and follow me. So which one is it? Is it what Zacchaeus has said, or is it what the rich young ruler has said, or is it the 10% to the 33%? Jesus doesn't prescribe any of that. And in the same way, I'm not here to prescribe any amount to you. We generally talk about 10% as a good guideline to start with, but even for some of us, maybe you need to start at 1%. Maybe you need to start at 2%. But notice, it's not the amount that Jesus is prescribing. It's basically, it's the heart that actually chooses that generosity is the better way. You know, I recently heard there's a professor of economics at the University of Virginia, Robert Elzinga, who's actually a committed Christian. And he was actually on this panel around generosity. And one of the things that he said was, he said when it comes to generosity, he tends to think of what is his sin bias coefficient. By coefficient, of course, it's a number. So like, what's his sin bias coefficient? And so one of the things that he talks about is, he said that he recognized that for himself, his propensity towards self-preservation, towards even greed, is probably a 3. So he says, if he thinks about giving something, he tries to multiply it by 3. And he says, so he approaches generosity. He realizes, okay, my sin bias coefficient is 3. So as a result, I'm going to give 3 times that amount. Now, I recognize, like some of us, that sin bias coefficient might be 2. It might be 0.1, 0.5, whatever it is. He's basically saying, listen, whatever your bias towards sin and self-preservation might be, what does it mean to, like, truly in faith live into generosity? Now, listen, I realize some of you might be like, well, what if my sin bias coefficient is 0? Listen, then your name is Devin Warwood. No, I'm just kidding. He's one of the sweetest men I know. So only he can say 0. No, I'm just kidding. But I just thought that was an interesting way to kind of challenge, what is my bias when it comes to self-preservation or be happy, and how do I live into that? Now, here's the thing. I realized when I first moved to the city, I graduated from university, and I moved out here to work with the urban poor at this church that was doing incredible work with the poor in Queens. And I've shared this story many times. I moved out here being a college graduate, and as I was moving to this church, I was like, oh, so what's my salary going to be? And then I remember the senior pastor looked at me. He's like, there's no salary here. You got to raise support. And I was like, what does that mean, raise support? And he goes, you have to raise your own money. Go to your friends and family and ask them to support you. And I was like, that's not a job. But I had this heart for learning how to do ministry. And so I I took the step of faith, and for the first time in my life, I went to raise support. I had raised support for other little trips here and there, but never for a whole year. So I was able to raise $7,500 total. And I lived off of that my first year, 2001 to 2002. Now, I lived with two other guys in this apartment in Flushing. One of the life hacks that I learned is, you guys know how we always have meals here and stuff? Listen, I always took the leftovers home. Just a little life hack. So I would live off of church leftovers and eggs and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Like that was, but listen, I look back at and I'm like, oh my goodness. I don't even know if I would recommend that to anyone nowadays. But I look back and I'm like, but I was at that age, I wouldn't recommend it for anyone, but I just remember just being so full of faith. Like, you know what? God's going to take care of me. And God has indeed taken care of me. Went to graduate school, was still working at a church, not making a whole lot of money, was saving and penny pinching whatever I could, trying to eat leftovers whenever I could, and trying to make ends meet. And I look back at my 20-year-old self, 21-year-old self, and I'm like, man, that kid was so full of faith. And then when I was working at a church, I got married, and my wife, she had an apartment in the city, which was awesome. Again, remember, but then I went through this season where I was leaving the church that I was at for many years, and when I was leaving that church, like the feelings of like, what am I going to do about a job? My wife and I, we were praying that we would have kids, and we didn't know if we could have kids. And I just think about all the anxiety that filled me at in that season of like, oh my gosh, how am I going to take care and support our family? And I remember leaving New Life Fellowship, the church that I was at, and taking the step of faith, believing that if God could really take care of us and take steps of faith. And you know what's crazy is God did. So I left, was entered into a season of unemployment, ended up starting Hope Church. Again, this season of like, oh my goodness. I look back at my 32-year-old self when we started Hope, and I'm like, gosh, that kid was crazy. I can't believe he trusted God in that way with his money. And you know what's interesting is like now, here we are, we're older, and like, again, Hope has gotten to a place of stability and self-sustaining, and honestly, there's constantly like, I realize the older I get, there's always this gravity back towards self-preservation. Looking out for myself and my family. And what does it look like for me to live into a kind of trust and a generosity? And even, and especially with money. And I just realized God has taken care of us throughout the years, and yet there's always like this gravity the older I get towards self-preservation. And even in preparation for this message, I've just been wrestling with God. What is unusual generosity look like for me and us? What is my sin bias coefficient? And just as you answered the bell at various stages of my life of the ways that you took care of us, how can I live into that? Now, the question though, remember, Jesus doesn't prescribe this to Zacchaeus. He doesn't say like, hey, listen, this is what you need to change if you want to follow me. Instead, what is it that really changes Zacchaeus? What is it? Did he preach a sermon on generosity and it changed his heart and immediately started to like change his bank account, automatic withdrawal to giving, is that what happened? And the reality is no. So this sermon probably is falling on deaf ears. Nonetheless, is that what changes people? A sermon? As much as I would like to think it does, no. What changed Zacchaeus? Where just without even any prompting, his life is fundamentally changed. What changes Zacchaeus? It's an encounter with Jesus. He met Jesus. He was filled with the joy, the power, freedom, the security in meeting Jesus, experiencing his grace, being shown in ultimate kindness, and it changes everything. See, the only way he could dare give up the one thing that is so hard for any one of us to give away is when we have finally actually experienced the life-changing encounter of meeting a gracious God. And he has been shown such kindness and joy that it changes everything. Have you ever had that experience of like feeling loved and secure? And that feeling of when you feel loved and secure, it just changes everything. So for instance, like when Tina and I, when my wife and I, when things are like a little rocky between us, right? Like things are rocky, don't feel loved, feel kind of like a deficit in my relationship, right? And my kids come to us and they're like, oh, can we have dessert? I'm like, no, you can't have dessert. I didn't have any dessert when I was growing up. I can't believe it. You guys are so spoiled. I can't believe it, right? Why? Because when I'm at a deficit relationally, that's just generally how I get. I get more stingy. But when Tina and I do you remember like when you were first falling in love? When Tina and I, when we first started dating, I didn't have a lot of money. But listen, when Tina and I were dating, and I felt like the flowering of love that was emerging between us, right? And different college students that I'd meet with them, and we'd go out together for whatever, for getting them ice cream or whatever, and I'm like, hey, it's on me, right? Like there's just a natural generosity that flows whenever we have the sense of security and love, belovedness, graciousness. It changes everything. See, and the Christian underpinnings of generosity and money, it always starts with, have you met the living Jesus? The Jesus who says that he will take care of you. Even in death, you will live. Even when you feel like your back is against the wall, there's a God who is for you and loves you. And see, what happened is Zacchaeus he met this Jesus. He meets this Jesus and his life is fundamentally changed. And the question for me and you is, have you encountered this Jesus? Have you met the living Jesus who tells you, listen, whatever you're going through with your career, with your family, I've got you. I love you. I want to stay at your house today. I want to meet you, and I'm going to take care of you. Even when it means giving up your money, I'm going to show you that I can be your fulfillment. See, ultimately, this story isn't just a story about money and generosity being a better way. It's a story, and the story of the Gospel of Luke is that Jesus is the better way. Jesus has always been the better way. See, and for a Christian, what it means is it's not about doing like some sort of like rote kind of practice of giving your money away. It's actually first having met the most generous of gods, Jesus himself, who would give his life away so that we could actually experience his love. Zacchaeus climbs the tree so he can see Jesus. Jesus climbs the tree, dies on a cross to show you that there is nothing he would spare to show you the full extent of his love and his graciousness. The question is, have you encountered this Jesus? Have you met him? And has he been the one that's given you the deepest sense of security in your own life and heart? Let's all stand together. The worship team come forward.